Hi, my name's Ray Harwood from Bigfoot Quest Magazine, and I'm speaking with Thomas Sewid of Sasquatch Island, and he's going to give us a really great story of how he met John Bindernagle and Peter Bairn. And go ahead, over to you, Thomas.
Yeah, look, Ursula, greetings. My name's Tom Sewid. I operate Sasquatch Island, the Facebook group, YouTube channel, website, and I attend quite a few conferences as a speaker performer. My wife and I bring forth a stage show where she comes out in my Kwakwaka'wakw tribal masks and regalia of Chonachla, our Sasquatch, onto the stages. But you know, where did it all begin? Well, it all began, I was living in bush and working in there and during the summer doing some tourism operations and native watchman programs for my tribe off northeastern Vancouver Island in a place called Village Island, our Mamlecha tribal territories. Abandoned Indian village, totem poles on the ground, big house remains, big pillars and beams, old houses abandoned and collapsing, falling apart, no windows. And tourists came there to see everything and all the history and experience this beautiful place. And I was a native watchman. And then eventually I would become a captain on a commercial wood salmon seine boat for the Canadian fishing companies. So I would be out on the water fishing. And then when I had days off, I go into Village Island, do my watchman's program. One of my crewmen, he helped me start that watchman's program in 1989. His name was Trevor. And I guess it was around 91, I guess. Trevor is my crewman, another native guy named Dean, and my girlfriend at the time, Jojo. We went into Village Island, anchored the boat out, went into the village just looking around, picking some plums, and it was early October, and there's a couple plums still remaining on the trees. And that afternoon, we picked a bunch of crab traps, and Dean and I were on deck of the boat cooking the crabs in a big, huge pot on a Coleman stove on the hatch covers. It was getting dark. There was no wind, very few clouds. The moon was coming out, and we're just enjoying the evening when all of a sudden, bang, you heard something hit the side of my 26-foot trailer that was parked up above the high tide mark in native Anchorage behind the village, and that's was my accommodation and crew quarters. And something hit it, and right away my mind, thought, was that one of the metal kerosene cans empty underneath the trailer? And I thought about it, because it was cooling down in the evening and could have contracted and banged like they do. But then I thought about it. I said, no, I removed those things last year. They're in my garage back at home. And thinking away, what could that noise be? Maybe a tree branch fell off or something. But I'm like, no, it was on the side of the trailer. It wasn't the roof. And then that's when we heard this whistling, warbling chirp. And I like to, it was pretty high pitched, but deep at the same time. And then we saw these two figures walk by the trailer. Now you got to remember that trailer in that 10 by 10 edition, the 10 by 10 edition was probably a foot and a half off the ground on stilts with a wood floor. It was 8 foot walls. The trailer had to be 8 foot high as well. But those two shadows that went across it were just below the trailer. So, probably 6.5, 7.5 feet was the height. And right away, you're thinking, okay, a couple of hippies playing around with us or what? And then all of a sudden you got that really bad smell. It's comparable to seeing a street person and pushing a shopping cart who's all filthy, dirty, and you get downwind on them and you smell that gagging human stench because they haven't bathed in who knows how long. We'll multiply that 20 or 30 times, and that's the smell we got. And then the whistling, warbling chirp again. My memory banks are just going through them, trying to think, what is that? Night bird, night owl, but no, I saw those two shadows and I'm hearing this whistling chirp. And so I opened the galley door and Trevor and Jojo were playing crib and they had a boom box going, but not too loud. But I told him, I said, turn that boom box off, the music. I said, there's something on the beach. You guys might want to come on deck. And just before I opened the galley door, you could hear Trevor bumming a cigarette off Jojo. Hey Jojo, can I get a cigarette off you? And she's like, oh, for God's sakes, did you spend all your money on the weekend, didn't buy cigarettes and bring it out for the fishing trip? And he's, whining away. And of course, she gives him one. So Trevor and Jojo came on deck, and the four of us were standing on starboard bulwarks deck of the boat, looking towards the trailer. And all of a sudden, you heard that whistling chirp and that stench. And Jojo goes to Dean, because when they're younger and teenagers, used to live on an island called Cortez Island, and they would dig shellfish and pick oysters to make extra money. So they're always on the beaches when they're younger at low tide. And Jojo goes, Dean, boy, that beach stinks. Dean turned and looked at her and goes, Josie, when have you smelled a beach like that? Besides, it's not that low of a tide and it's rising right now. And that whistling chirp again. And then Trevor looked at me and his eyes, I always remember, were just bugged. He goes, whoa, what was that, Tom? And I said, I think that's your visitor that we had here last fall. I think a couple Sasquatches are on the beach. Trevor had half his cigarette that he mooched off Jojo. He flicked it over into the water. He turned around. He went through the galley door, opened the engine room door, down the metal ladder, across the metal floor plates, opened the big steel bulwark door, and you could hear that squeak and bang. And that was the last we saw of Trevor. He didn't want anything to do with that possible Sasquatch on the beach. So Dean and I had an idea. We moved to the pilot house. So you have the command bridge, which is open steering wheel and throttles up on the top of the cabin. Then you have your pilot house with windows and a steering wheel and your electronics and throttle and everything in there. We went to the pilot house, and I had the side door I opened up, and Dean was looking at the spotlight, and I was grabbing the handle on the ceiling in the pilot house, turning the spotlight, and he was looking at roughly where it was going to point when I turned it on. And he goes, right there, Tom. And then I went, three, two, one, hit the light switch, and that spotlight illuminated a big Sasquatch up in the above high tide in the grass and the shrubs, and it just dropped on his knee and brought its arm up in front of his face. The female, which was at the high tide mark down on the beach, she had her back to us, and she dropped on her knees with her head on the ground, almost like a fetal position, bent over. We could see her big hairy buttocks. And then you could see her eye under her right armpit looking at the spotlight. And you can see that big male, two eyes, one and a half eye, as its arm was moving like that, looking at the spotlight. And so we're, oh, what the hell is that deer? And, we knew damn well what it was. And we had the spotlight on for quite a while. We tried to right away. It's like, get the camera. Jojo ran inside, grabbed the 35 millimeter camera. And, she's a small blonde girl with a lot of character and attitude. I'll put it that way. And you hear F bombing away, ripping drawers open, trying to look for film because no film was in the camera, 35 millimeter. And finally, she, there's no beeping film. So we had no camera. So we went out on the bow, and, we wanted to get them to move. I'd like to see them, side profile like Patty in the film. So we started throwing apples and potatoes and towards them, but, we couldn't reach them. They're a good 60, 80 yards from us or on the beach, but, we're splashing the water with what we're throwing, but they would not move. Just that arm moving just like that and seeing the eyes reflecting. But one of the things that really captivated me being a hunter, was, deer in British Columbia, Vancouver Island, and rut. They're really red when you put a spotlight on them. Then they go to orangish. And then, those are usually green like a cat or a dog. Well, that male Sasquatch was reddish orange, and then after 5 or 10 minutes, it started to diminish to more of a yellowish um, green. And the female, she was yellowish green right from the get-go the whole time with the reflection. So anyway, they weren't going to move, and I was getting worried about my batteries. This boat was built in 1927, and it's who knows how old those batteries were down the engine room because it was a company boat. I didn't do the maintenance on it. I just picked it up and went fishing every summer. So anyway, I shut the spotlight off, and that's you could hear them get up, and you could hear that crack, swoosh, crack, swoosh, and then the wall of hemlock and cedar and spruce be opened up, and you can hear them walking there, and the odd little crack of a branch. They weren't hiding that they were there. You could definitely hear that crack, snap, and then they stopped. And then you heard this big rotten tree get pushed down towards us and hear it crash. Yes, the next day we went in and truthed it and found out it was a rotten hemlock about that diameter, probably 30 feet high anyway. So they were definitely pissed that we put the spotlight on them. And it got quiet. So Jojo went to bed, and Dean and I stayed up in the bridge smoking cigarettes and just listening. And it was probably an hour later when the bay to our left, where how the boat was pointing, it we could hear one of those what we call a shagpoke or a blue heron. They're big herring type crane birds, and you could hear it rah 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 rah, and they got spooked. It was sleeping in the head of the bay and probably sitting on a rock at a little creek, and it flew out of the bay and past the boat and making its ruckus noise. And so something spooked it, and then that's when we could hear it walking across the boulders on the beach. It would eventually come beside the boat, and Dean and I were standing by the galley door looking, and we're like 65 yards from the beach, flat calm, and we could see this thing creeping down low, walking bipedally. And then Dean goes, "What the F is that?" And that thing stood up, and I always remember the hairs hanging off the shoulders and under the big arms hanging down. And, it was about that long. And, it was freaky. And it went into the bush. We put the spotlight on it. It whistled for its mate, really high pitched, deep, very high pitched whistle came back in the bushes. And you'd hear them walking through the slough together, crash, crunch, crunch, crunch. So slough is flat leaf green bush shrub that grows out here in the Pacific Northwest coastal regions. With this time of year, I'm looking out my window at a slough bush. They have purple berries similar to blueberries. I make jams and jelly out of it, and bears and everything eats it. But when you walk through slough bush, it's like grabbing a plastic tarp and shaking it. That's what it sounds like, the waxy leaves. So you could hear these two come together. Then they disappeared deeper into the slough, went to the back of the village. I guess they were going into the village to pick what few plums remained and crab apples and apples in the abandoned native village. You got to remember we had fruit trees back in the day, and now they're all wild there. And that was my encounter. And it was written in Dr. John Bindernagle's book, North America's Undiscovered Great Ape, the Sasquatch. And but I didn't know John. I went, did my commercial fishery and then put my boat to port. And on the weekend, I drove down to my parents' house in eastern Vancouver Island. I was up on the north end of the island. Anyway, I drove to Qualicum Beach and went and visited my parents. And I was telling my dad about the Sasquatch encounter. And my dad, after I told him, he's like, "Well, it's something because just a week or so ago, the knock on the door and I answered it. And there was a white-haired, bearded gentleman, and he was all excited. And he goes, "Are you Mr. Alvin Sewid?" And I'm Dr. John Bindernagle. I'm a Sasquatch investigator. My dad sort of like, it surprised him, but my dad invited him in, and it's our way. And John had been doing a school presentation in Campbell River, north of Qualicum, where I lived. And I guess this young cousin of mine, Norman Sewid Jr., got up in class. He was just a young boy and said, "Hey, my Uncle Alvin Sewid saw a Sasquatch." And so, anyway, that's how John tracked down my dad in the phone book and went and seen him. And my dad said, "Well, I didn't actually see that one, but my friend did. And here's the report, and here's other reports and encounter stories I have." And John gave him his phone number and said, "If you have any more stories or whatever." And he mentioned about me. Well, my son lives in the bush most of the time, and maybe he has some things to tell you. I know he's talked about it. So my dad gave me John's phone number, and I phoned him and introduced myself, told him I just had this pretty good encounter. And John, he just got all excited. He's, "Oh, when you go to Campbell River, can you stop by and visit me? And I'd like to hear everything." And he's all excited. That was his nature. So I said, "Yeah, I'm heading back north tomorrow. I'll stop by in the afternoon." So I went to his address in Courtney, and man, his house was something. There's 3 stories. There's fossils and shells all over outside, and old fish boats and all kinds of knickknack junk treasures you couldn't, imagine. Inside his house was a giant weaver bird nest up above his chair on the wall, and there was papers and boxes of books. And because he was a doctor of ecology and biology, and he was you know, to me, he was the mad scientist. That's what I used to tease him because he was so eccentric and so excitable. So I gave him my report and I told him I had a fish boat. And if you wanted to come out with me, I'm going hunting and clam digging before I bring the boat back. And so that year he came out with me. I think we went out for a couple days, and that's when our friendship sort of really began. And, you know, we got along great because, you know, John and I could talk about Sasquatch because of all the books I'd read, the lifestyle I led. You know, it's my start of living in the bush. I'd been already been hunting for years. And being First Nation, I had all of that tied to all of the tribal cultural knowledge and perspectives and beliefs on Jonah, the Sasquatch from the Kwakwaka'wakw tribe I belong to. But being a commercial fisherman, having traveled the coast constantly, and I was in the prime of my career then, you know, I was interacting with other tribal groups, homesteaders, and you name it. So I was always asking about Sasquatch. So I was able to share that with John. But also, I was, you know, pretty well educated in the Ivy League private school during some of my grades of high school. It was a private boarding school in Vancouver Island. Plus, I'd always been a book addict, heading books and everything. So John would say later on in our friendship that, you know, you're one of the few I can talk to. You know, we used to talk about Gigantopithecus blackie possibly being the Sasquatch, and then we changed our theories and beliefs after more science came in, and then we spoke about how before he died, how the Hobbit from what would be Aryan Jaya could possibly be North America's Bookwus, the little people, the hair-covered bipedal creatures. That's a whole different subject to talk about later. But John would phone me and invite me to 1997 to a conference at the planetarium in Vancouver, British Columbia, to, I guess, probably one of our first Sasquatch conferences in Canada. So I went down there at that time. I was looking after a young lady by the name of Jenny. She was my foster daughter, blonde hair, blue eyes, fair skin, not Indian, and cute as a whatever. And, you know, she was, you know, teenage girl, but a lot of fun. But she came with me and she's laughing away. Sasquatch conference? Are you kidding me? I'm like, come on, it's a, you know, we're gonna stay in Vancouver. I'll bring you shopping for clothes, whatever. And she's okay, let's go. So we went. And when I got there, walked in and John introduced me to a few of the people. I believe it was Grover Krentz was the first person he introduced me to, and a few others. And you know, I didn't know anyone. You know, it wasn't a industry like it is now, and you know, it was, you know, sort of. I didn't even know there's people who are investigators. You know, I was kind of intrigued that, you know, it's not just this eccentric John Bindernagle. There's other people that are interested in the subject, and you know, Thomas Steinberg was there. I understand, and Todd Neese and Peter Byrne, because when I went in, I was listening to the speakers and I was pretty intrigued. And then Peter Byrne spoke about his trips to the Nepal and different places like that. And I was really enthralled because I seen the guy on TV. I'm like, wow, this guy's like a celebrity. And you know, if you're on TV, you're automatically a celebrity. So anyway, John spoke and he invited me on the stage and he said, Tom's going to share with you some of his encounter and some of his beliefs and perspectives coming from the First Nations, the Indians, which, you know, even to this day, we get very little input from the indigenous people in North America at Sasquatch conferences unless I'm there or Mel Scahan, you know, and one or two others, but mainly it's non-Indians that get the spotlight. And you know, us Indians got so much to bring. So I got on stage and I just enthralled everyone with that this young man, you know, probably my early 30s knowledge he had. And when I opened it up for questions, who should stand up? Peter Byrne. And, you know, he was really enthralled. And then afterwards, you know, went out on to the hallway to get a beverage and hot dog, and Peter Byrne tracked me down, and me and him was just chatter like Sasquatches for about a good 20 minutes or longer. And all of a sudden, Bindernagle joined us, and I believe it was Grover Krentz who joined us. And here I am with the old guard, the old horsemen of the Sasquatchology. And back then, you know, I was just like all eyes and wild. And I remember looking over, and there's Jenny. And at that time, river dance was a big thing. Shania Twain was a big thing with her purple halter top and her jeans on stage. Well, that's what Jenny looked like with her little blonde, long blonde ponytail. And of course, every young cameraman and reporter in the joint from BCTV, Canadian television, and others all got their cameras on this cute little blonde Barbie doll, Jenny, and she's just chattering away like a Sasquatch about Sasquatches. And I was kind of listening and I was intrigued because, wow, here I am. I've been dragging her on the bush and on boats, and she's actually listened and learned. And she actually knows quite a bit about Sasquatches. She just liked being all the attention and cameras. But it was funny because after the conference, we're in the hotel room watching the 11 o'clock news, and it was like, Vancouver has a Sasquatch conference starring Jenny, and it was all Jenny being shown on TV talking about Sasquatches. So it was pretty comical from that conference. But I got to meet Peter Byrne and the other members of the old guard. Thomas Steinberg's one of the very few that are still with us, and Daniel Perez. Most of the old guard now. They're up there sitting with Sasquatches, learning everything we're trying to find out down here. So that's how I met Peter, and it's John Bindernagle was the one that really opened that up to me. That you say it, Tom, 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 Tom. Don't hold back. You're an Indian. You're an Indian, and you Indians need to force open the door and tell us about Sasquatches because that's where the knowledge is with your people. So I would help him, and he would buy a boat, and he would end up being a Bella Clem too in the central British Columbia coast. And I'm pretty sure Les Stroud, when he heard about John talking about going to Clem too, that's probably what he probably even phoned John to get an idea. If I'm going to do a Sasquatch documentary, where should I go? And I'm pretty sure John told him, go to Clem too. That central coast of British Columbia. It's on like Donkey Kong. And I could vouch for that. I was there in March and I face to face saw a Sasquatch from the top cabin of the herring's boat I was on, seine boat. It's about 70 feet long steel, and I was up digging through the freezer to get something for dinner. And when I closed the lid, I just happened to look at the cedar wall of trees as we're drifting out of this channel, a mouth to a lagoon we couldn't make in because the tide was falling. But the captain was just in neutral, and we're drifting back with the current. And I'm just looking in the bushes. I'm a bushman. I like looking at a bush. You never know what you're going to see. And all of a sudden, there's two cedar trees. And as I look at it, I'm like, holy shit, there's a Sasquatch. And I'm one, two, three, four. And it disappeared in the current. And I was just like, Jesus, ran up to the upper cabin, jumped on a big aluminum box up there and storing gear. And I stood on that to elevate myself, looking down into the forest. And all I heard was a tree snap, like something foot went on a big branch. And you're correct, but I'd seen some bush move, but I didn't see it again. But I locked the Sasquatch in the Central Coast. That was pretty neat. So John Bindernagle, he like I teased him once. I'm like, what did you do to your prodigal son? You created a monster. I said, I don't have time no more. I got to go to conferences. I got to go to do podcasts and video casts. I'm doing interviews. I got all this stuff in my mind I got to write down. And John just laughed and he goes, it's good. He goes, it was good to see you come as far as you are. And this is just before he passed. I'll share a picture I already sent them to you with John where I'm in his yard and there's snow on the ground. And, it was about 3 weeks before he passed. So I was with him right up until, he left us. But he was a great man, good friend of mine. I used to have fun with him out there. But he's introduced me to so much more. Like, sure, I look at you watch TV and you see all these people on TV. I've never met in only ones I've met in person from Expedition Bigfoot, the new raging series that's out season 4 is Russell Accord when he invited me to his Bigfoot conference, International Bigfoot Conference in Yakima a few years back. I met him there, and then I met Ronnie LeBlanc, I believe, was there, or one of the other ones. I know I met Ronnie, but I've never met the female that's on that show and that other guy. But every other show, whether it be David Paulides or Jeff Meldrum, Cliff Barrickman, Bobo, I've met them all, and the Olympic Project, and the list goes on. And they're all good friends of mine. We go to conferences and have a few beers at the end of the conference downstairs and chatter like Sasquatches. And we do expeditions together. And one of the things that's going on is we're here at September 1st. Wow, it's already September 2023. And 2 days from now, on Monday, I'll be launching from Seattle on the first ever Alaska Bigfoot cruise with, I believe it's Celebrity Cruise Lines. Anyway, they bought 200 cabins and sold out, and there's almost 400 people coming on this cruise. And Peggy and I are going to be performing, and I'll be speaking on the ship, and then doing a bus tour in Ketchikan and Victoria on the way back. And then in Juneau, we're having a town hall meeting, and then the other presenters aboard ship will be there as well, Dr. Jeff Meldrum and David Pilates. So it's historic, this Bigfoot cruise. And I'm sure it's going to be going on next year. I'll be doing mothership cruises next starting this winter. But anyway, that's a whole different subject. But it's all about what John Bindernagle introducing me to all these people that are now on TV, write books, do television shows and that. And it was all John's doing. He had a belief in me. And, he would come with me, and we would go to Village Island on my commercial seine boat. The crew I left on Vancouver Island, it was our days off. And John and I would load up a bunch of beer and ice, and we'd go out fishing to get some fresh food and crab. And then we'd go into Village Island because I had to make money. So I said, yeah, I got to go in for a couple hours and do my narrative tours to the sea kayakers and the people coming in on their dinghies from their sailboats and yachts. So I go in there, charge them $10 a head, walk them through the totem poles, tell them all the history and everything. And John would be there, and he goes, "You're pretty good at public speaking." And I said, "Well, this is my stage, front of these big house beams and horizontal beams on top, which used to be the framework of a traditional big house. I've been here since 1989, every summer, walking around, giving narrative tours, a stream of consciousness narrative, and bringing the village back to life so people could envision what it looked like before contact, just afterwards, what it was like traveling around our territories, because our villages were always moving about for seasonal harvest, just like a Sasquatch. And of course, living out there in Timbuk flipping nowhere, you'd as soon as it started getting dark, you're sleeping. You didn't want to hear those night sounds. You didn't have TV or electricity, so you got no business being up at dark. So humans of the day, what do? Go to sleep. And you'd wake up, and back then I was younger, and nowadays with diabetes and age, I'm up 2, 3 times a night going to the bathroom. Back then, man, when I put my head down, it was down until the birds started tweetering at daylight. But every so often you'd wake up, and being a bushman, okay, I'm awake now. What woke me up? Why did I wake up? And then you'd hear that, and then you'd hear that pulling of plums off the branch, or you'd hear the walking from one tree to another through the thimbleberry and blackberry bushes, and you could hear the snap, crack, whoosh, snap. And I'm like, that's not a bear, that's not a deer. And they you left them alone, they left you alone. They knew I was sleeping in there. They hear me snoring and farting, and I'm sleeping, and they went about their business. And the next morning when I got up, I'd go walk around and look where they were harvesting what plum tree and so forth. And you could tell by the push through the trees, the bushes, and you could tell by the footfalls that, yeah, you were right. It wasn't a bear or a deer last night. It was a chonach, a Sasquatch in the village. And then of course I'd phone John up, and then your bloody Sasquatches in my village, and he'd be all, "Oh, whoa, 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 I'll drive to Port McNeill. I'll be there in 4 hours." And I'd run my boat into Port McNeill, go grab him, and load up on kokanee Sasquatch beer, and off we go and do investigating. And I remember times sitting on deck, and you hear John quietly snoring, and all of a sudden I have to kick him. "John, get up!" And he, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, what, Sasquatch?" I'm like, "No, turn your goddamn hearing aids down. All I can hear is hissing and ringing noise." And he'd turn them both down because he was pretty much deaf because of after he got his biology degree and he was working on his doctorate, he went to Africa and he was teaching the indigenous people how to harvest ungulates, hoofed animals for food and other animals. So he would drive the Land Rover, and he said they were on the roll bar with the big rifles above his head, plugging away, shooting animals, and that's what made him deaf. But
Mhm.
like I say, this one talking about John Bindernagle, I can go on for hours, some of the things we did, but I can just say that I was honored that I was able to spend so much of my life with John Bindernagle. He introduced me to Peter Byrne and many other people. And now I'm going on this Bigfoot cruise, and that's all because of John Bindernagle. So I'll leave it at that. But everyone that's listening, Sasquatch Island, don't forget to go to Facebook and ask to join if you haven't. go to my YouTube channel, hit the bell icon so you can be reminded when I post videos, and I'll be sharing Ray's videos on there as well. Sasquatch, Bigfoot Quest Magazine and videocasts now. And don't forget to slap that subscribe button like Rogue Sasquatch slaps a disrespectful Sasquatch investigator upside the head before he eats him, makes him a steaming coiler in the forest. So always respect your Sasquatch. Be safe out there. And I thank you very much. And Ray, thank you having me on your Bigfoot Quest Magazine videocast.
Thanks, Thomas. It was really great speaking with you. And perhaps we might be able to get a feed from the Bigfoot cruise. If that's the case, we'll be posting that on the podcast. And otherwise, when Thomas gets back, we'll continue and have some guests and maybe some roundtable discussions. Some of the Bigfoot community has expressed some interest in that, and they want to pick Thomas's brain for sure. So thanks very much for listening, and we'll see you on the next podcast.